There has never been another ship quite like her, and there never will be. In the long history of sail, across thousands of years of masts and rigging and canvas stretched to catch the wind, only one vessel was ever built with 7 masts standing in a single line along her deck. She was launched once, she sailed for a handful of years, and when she was gone, the design went with her. No shipwright ever repeated it. No owner ever asked for it again. She stands alone in the record, a singular answer to a question no one else thought to ask, and in that solitude lies most of what makes her worth remembering. Picture her for a moment before the story properly begins. Picture 7 steel masts rising in sequence along a single deck, evenly spaced, each one taller than the buildings that lined the harbour she was built beside. No gaff-rigged schooner before her had ever needed more than 6, and even 6 was rare enough to draw a crowd to the waterfront. 7 was something else entirely, a silhouette that broke every expectation a sailor of that era carried in his mind about what a schooner was supposed to look like. Men who had spent their whole lives on the water, who could read a rig from a mile off and tell you her tonnage before she came fully into view, found themselves without the vocabulary to describe her at first glance. She did not look like a mistake. She looked like a question mark drawn against the sky, and for a little while, the entire Atlantic seaboard tried to work out what she meant. It helps to understand what kind of moment in history produced a ship like this, because she could not have been built 10 years earlier, and she would not have been built 10 years later. This was the last true twilight of the age of sail, a strange, uneven decade at the turn of the 20th century when wind-powered ships and steam-powered ships shared the same harbours, the same shipping lanes, sometimes even the same cargo runs, each still uncertain which of them truly belonged to the coming century. Steam had already proven itself faster, more reliable, less dependent on the whims of weather. Coal-fired engines did not wait for a favourable wind. They did not sit becalmed for days at a time while a captain paced his quarterdeck and stared at a flat, glassy sea. And yet sail had not surrendered. Not yet. There remained in these final years a stubborn conviction among certain ship owners and financiers that wind and canvas could still be made to compete with fire and iron, if only the scale were pushed far enough, if only the economics were reimagined boldly enough. It was a belief on borrowed time, though no one quite knew yet how little time was left. And it was exactly this belief, half genuine calculation, half sheer nerve, that gave rise to the ship at the center of this story. Her name was the Thomas W. Lawson, and she was named in the fashion of the age after the man who financed her. Thomas W. Lawson was not a sailor. He was not a shipwright, nor a man who had spent his youth learning the ways of rope and canvas the way many great ship patrons of earlier centuries had. He was a financier, a Boston stockbroker who had made and lost fortunes on the strength of speculation, a man known for restless ambition and for a taste for spectacle that extended well beyond the trading floor. He had built an enormous estate. He had written books about his own financial exploits with a candor that scandalized as much as it impressed. And now, in the early years of the 1900s, he turned that same restless appetite toward the sea and toward a question that had occurred to almost no one else in quite the same way. What if a sailing ship could be made so large, so efficient in her rigging, that she might undercut steam on cost alone, at least for the right cargo, over the right distance? It is worth pausing here on the paradox, sitting quietly at the center of this whole undertaking, because it shapes everything that follows. The Thomas W. Lawson was built in large part to prove that sail still had a future, that the old technology, given enough scale and enough steel in her bones, could still hold its own against the steamships that were already reshaping the world's shipping lanes. And yet, she was built in the very years when that future was closing. She was, in a sense, an argument made just as the debate was ending. Every rivet driven into her hull, every mast raised into place, was part of a case being built for sail's survival, delivered at the exact historical moment when the verdict was already beginning to go the other way. There is something quietly moving in that timing, a grand gesture made not in ignorance of the tide turning, but almost in defiance of it. Whether Lawson himself saw it this way, whether he understood he was staking his ambition on a technology in its final years, the historical record does not say for certain. But the ship he commissioned would carry that tension in her very design, in the strange marriage of an old familiar sailing rig with a hull and frame built entirely from the newest material of the industrial age. To understand how such a vessel came to exist at all, it helps to place yourself gently in a particular time and a particular place. The turn of the 20th century. Quincy, Massachusetts, a town on the shores of Boston Harbor, its waterfront humming with the particular energy of American industry at its most confident. This was not some sleepy cove where wooden schooners had been built by hand for generations, following patterns passed down from father to son. Quincy was the site of a shipyard that had already made its name working in iron and steel. A yard that built for the modern age, that understood plate and rivet and frame the way older yards understood oak and pine. It was an unusual place to build what was, at its heart, a schooner, a rig with roots stretching back centuries, associated in most minds with wooden hulls and a simpler kind of vessel. But this was precisely the marriage that made the Thomas W. Lawson possible. An old rig reimagined in a new material, built not by handcraft traditions passed down through generations of shipwrights, but by the same industrial methods being used to build steamships and ironclads. It was in its way as strange a hybrid as the ship's silhouette itself, modernity and antiquity welded together into one steel hull. The people gathered along the Fore River in those years, watching the yard at work, would not yet have known what they were about to see take shape on the building slip. They knew ships. They had watched hulls rise before, had seen keels laid and frames go up and hulls plated over with steel. But nothing in their experience had quite prepared them for a schooner rig stretched across 7 masts, each one meant to carry vast quantities of canvas, each one demanding a scale of engineering that no wooden shipwright of the old school would have dared attempt. What was coming was, by every meaningful measure, a giant without a category, too large and too strange to be judged by the standards that had governed sailing ships for centuries, and too tied to an old rig to be understood simply as a modern steel vessel like the tankers and colliers rising nearby. Before this story moves any further into the shipyard, into the ambitions of the man who ordered her built, and into the extraordinary engineering challenge of raising 7 masts where no one had ever raised more than 6, it seems only fitting to pause and offer a quiet invitation. If stories like this one, of ships built at the outer edge of what their age thought possible, of the strange and singular vessels history sometimes produces and then quietly lets go, hold any appeal for you, consider staying with this channel a while longer. There is no urgency in the offer, no need to act on it now, simply a door left open, should you wish to return for more. For now, let the story rest where it stands, a shipyard on the Fore River, an ambitious financier with a fortune to spend and a point to prove, and the first quiet stirrings of a design that had never existed before, and that history would never see repeated. The age of sail was ending. But before it ended, it would produce one final singular giant, 7 masts, steel-boned, unlike anything that had come before her, and unlike anything that would ever come after. The man behind that design carried a name that Boston, in the final years of the 19th century, had learned to say with a mixture of admiration and unease. Thomas W. Lawson was not a shipbuilder, nor a sailor, nor a man who had spent any part of his life before the mast. He was a financier, a speculator, a figure who had risen out of modest beginnings to become one of the most conspicuous fortunes in a city that prided itself on old money and quiet manners. Lawson possessed neither. He had made his wealth loudly in the copper markets and in the great speculative churn of the Gilded Age, and he seemed to feel that a fortune made loudly deserved to be spent the same way. He built a mansion at Dreamwold in Scituate, with gardens and stables and peacocks wandering the grounds, and he cultivated a public image that was as much a part of his business as any stock certificate. He gave interviews. He wrote essays. He seemed, in the accounts that survive, to regard himself as a figure of history, even while history was still deciding what to make of him. His fortune had come from copper, and more specifically from the frenzied trading in copper stocks that defined a certain restless corner of American finance at the turn of the century. Lawson had a gift for it, a gift for reading the mood of a market before it moved, and for moving other people's money in ways that enriched him whether the market rose or fell. He was, by his own later account and by the accounts of those who watched him work, a man of considerable nerve. He speculated boldly, he spoke boldly, and in 1905 he would publish a book, serialized first and then bound, called Frenzied Finance, in which he turned his sharp eye on the very system that had made him rich, exposing its manipulations with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his own place at its center. It was a strange kind of honesty, self-implicating and self-congratulating at once, and it captured something essential about Lawson's character. He was a man who believed his own story was worth telling, in detail, and preferably in his own words. It was this same appetite for telling his own story that would later lead him to write of his ship much as he wrote of himself, boldly and without much patience for modesty. But before there was a book about the ship, there had to be a reason for the ship to exist at all, and the reason, like so much else in Lawson's life, began with a calculation. By the closing years of the 1890s, Lawson had turned part of his attention and his considerable capital toward shipping, and specifically toward the coastwise trade that carried coal, lumber, and other bulk cargoes along the Atlantic seaboard of the United States. It was not the most glamorous corner of American commerce, but it was a steady one, and Lawson, whatever else might be said of him, understood commerce. He understood that steamships, for all their speed and reliability, carried a persistent and unavoidable cost: coal to fire their boilers, engineers and firemen to tend them, machinery that required maintenance and skilled hands. A sailing vessel needed none of this. It needed wind, which was free, and it needed sailors, who were considerably cheaper to employ than engineers, and fewer of them were required per ton of cargo carried than most people who had never studied a shipping ledger might assume. This was the seed of the idea that would eventually become the Thomas W. Lawson. If a schooner could be built large enough, the economics of the thing shifted further still in the vessel's favor. A larger hull meant more cargo space, but it did not necessarily mean a proportionally larger crew, provided the rigging could be arranged so that sail could be raised, trimmed, and lowered without an army of hands to do it. This was the central commercial logic that justified, at least on paper, an enormous wooden or steel-hulled schooner rigged with more masts than any vessel of her type had ever carried. Fewer sailors per ton of cargo if, and it was a considerable if, the rigging itself could be made to work. Every additional mast added canvas and therefore power, but it also added complexity, and complexity had a way of demanding hands that the whole scheme was meant to save. The challenge then was not simply to build something larger. It was to build something larger that still made sense as a machine for moving coal cheaply from one American port to another. It is worth pausing here on the kind of man Lawson was, because the ship that would eventually bear his name cannot be separated from his temperament. He was not a reticent investor, content to let his money speak for him from a distance. He was a man who inserted himself into his own ventures with evident relish, who enjoyed being written about nearly as much as he enjoyed writing, and who seemed to regard even his failures as material, stories to be shaped and told, preferably by himself. Later, after the ship had been built and had gone to sea, Lawson would write his own account of her, a slim book that read less like a shipping company's technical record and more like a proud father's description of a remarkable child. He described her dimensions, her rigging, her capabilities, with the enthusiasm of a man convinced that he had done something no one else had thought to attempt, and in this he was, in fact, correct. No one else had attempted it, before or since. And so, when the time came to give the vessel a name, Lawson did what perhaps only a man of his particular self-regard would do without a flicker of hesitation. He named her after himself, not after a wife, nor a daughter, nor a patriotic sentiment, nor any of the other conventions that typically furnished the names painted across the bows of great sailing ships in that era. He simply called her the Thomas W. Lawson. It was, on its surface, a small detail, a matter of paperwork, a line on a builder's contract. but it revealed a great deal about the man who insisted upon it. Ships, traditionally, were named for the people who loved them, or for the ideals their owners wished to be associated with. Lawson skipped the intermediary sentiment entirely and placed his own name directly onto the hull, as if the ship itself was simply an extension of his public persona, one more vehicle, like his book, like his mansion, like his interviews, for the Lawson name to travel further than it might otherwise have gone. To build a vessel of this scale and this ambition, however, self-regard alone was not sufficient. Lawson needed a shipyard capable of engineering a design that had no true precedent, a yard willing to gamble its reputation on a set of drawings that broke sharply from everything conventional shipbuilding practice had settled upon over the preceding decades. He found what he needed on the banks of the Fall River in Quincy, Massachusetts, at a shipyard that had begun to make a name for itself constructing steel-hulled vessels at a moment when much of the American sailing fleet was still built from wood in the older, more familiar way. The Fall River shipyard, under the direction of the engineers and builders who ran it, had the technical confidence and the steel construction expertise that a project of this magnitude demanded. A wooden hull large enough to carry the cargo Lawson wanted, rigged with the number of masts his commercial logic required, would very likely have flexed and strained itself apart under its own scale long before it ever left the builder's yard. Steel offered something wood could not: a hull that could be engineered to hold its shape, to resist the twisting stresses of an enormous sail plan, to be calculated rather than merely built by inherited habit and craftsman's instinct. It was to these builders on the Fall River that Lawson brought his idea, and it was here in the drafting rooms and along the slipways of a yard already known for steel construction that the strange and singular shape of the ship began quietly to take form. The financier had his commercial logic. The shipyard had the steel and the engineering confidence to attempt what that logic demanded. Between the two of them, a design was about to emerge that no vessel before it had ever carried, and that no vessel built afterward would ever repeat: a great steel schooner rigged not with the usual handful of masts, but with 7, each one a further wager on the idea that bigger, after all, might still mean better, provided a man like Lawson was willing to risk the money to prove it. No one had built such a ship before, and the plain truth of that fact sat at the center of every conversation that followed among the men who would have to make her real. Schooners had grown steadily larger through the 19th century, adding masts as owners and captains discovered that a taller rig, spread across more sticks, could move more sail with fewer hands than the square-rigged ships that had dominated ocean trade for generations. It was an economy of labor as much as an economy of speed. A schooner rig, with its simple triangular and quadrilateral sails set fore and aft, could be worked by a crew a fraction the size needed to man the yards of a full-rigged ship. That arithmetic had already pushed builders from 3 masts to 4, then to 5, and by the final years of the 1800s, to 6. Each new mast was not simply an increase in size, but a new problem in balance, in strain, in the distribution of enormous forces across a hull never designed by any inherited rule to carry them. The 6-masted schooners that had come before, vessels already regarded as marvels of the coastal and coal trade, had tested the edges of what riggers and sailmakers believed a fore and aft vessel could reasonably do. To ask for a 7th mast was to step past every existing case study into a region where the calculations could be extended by analogy but never fully verified by precedent, because there was no precedent. It had simply never been done. The naval architects who took up the problem understood this without needing it explained to them twice. Whatever confidence they carried into the work, it was not the confidence of men repeating a known formula. It was the more careful confidence of men extending a known formula as far as it could reasonably go, watching for the point at which it might begin to fail. Every added mast meant an added weight of timber or steel aloft, an added spread of canvas to catch the wind, an added set of rigging lines threading down to a deck that had to remain, through it all, navigable by a crew still numbering only a few dozen souls. The central question the designers turned over was not whether a hull could be built long enough and broad enough to carry 7 masts. That, given enough steel, was simply an exercise in scaling upward. The harder question was whether such a rig, once raised, could still be sailed by hands few enough to make the ship commercially sensible. A ship that required a small army to work her sails defeated the very purpose for which the coal trade wanted her. The calculations that mattered most, then, were not only about wind and displacement and the tensile strength of a steel plate, but about the geometry of ropes and winches, about how far a single man could be expected to travel along a deck the length of a city block to reach a halyard in time, about how the sails themselves might be reduced in number even as the masts that carried them increased, so that a smaller set of larger sails could do the work that many smaller ones might otherwise have required. The man most associated with translating Lawson's ambition into lines on paper and the yard that carried those lines into steel worked with the particular caution of people aware that failure in a ship this size would not be a private embarrassment, but a public and possibly fatal one. The historical record of exactly who deserves credit for the final lines of the Thomas W. Lawson is not as complete or as tidy as later admirers of the ship might wish, but what survives points clearly enough to the Four Rivers Ship and Engine Company of Quincy, Massachusetts, the yard entrusted with the physical work of building her, and to the design tradition of large steel schooners that had already been advancing, mast by mast, in the years just before her keel was laid. The yard had built steel vessels before, though nothing quite of this configuration, and it approached the commission with the mixture of caution and confidence typical of engineers handed a problem just beyond the edge of their prior experience. Enough confidence to accept the job, enough caution to work the numbers twice before cutting the first plate. That caution showed itself most clearly in the decision to build in steel rather than the timber that had framed every earlier great schooner. Wood had limits that no amount of skill could fully overcome. A wooden hull, however carefully framed and however many diagonal straps or iron reinforcements were worked into her structure, could only be stretched to a certain length before her own weight, and the working of the sea against her length began to open her seams and rack her frame loose. The largest wooden schooners built in that era had already approached those limits, their builders reinforcing them with iron strapping in an effort to hold a long wooden hull rigid against the twisting forces of an ocean swell. Steel offered a way past that ceiling entirely. A steel hull could be built longer, could be built with less flex, could carry heavier masts and more sail without the slow, silent failure of a wooden frame giving way under its own scale. It was still, in the American schooner trade, an unusual choice. Steel was more commonly the material of larger, square-rigged ships and of the new steamers beginning to compete for cargo, not of the fore and aft coasting schooners that had traditionally been built of oak and pine along New England shores. But the ambitions attached to this particular ship demanded a hull that wood could not, in good conscience, be asked to provide, and so steel it would be, whatever murmurs that decision provoked among more conservative men of the trade. And there were murmurs. They came not as public denunciations, but as the quiet, skeptical conversation of men who had spent their lives around schooners and were not entirely persuaded that 7 masts represented progress rather than excess. Rival shipbuilders, watching the plans circulate or hearing of them second-hand, wondered aloud whether a rig so large could ever be handled safely by a crew small enough to make her profitable, or whether her owners would find themselves needing more hands than the economics of the coal trade could bear. Sailors who had worked 6-masted schooners and knew firsthand how much a single additional mast changed the feel and behavior of a ship under sail were similarly cautious, trading opinions in the particular manner of men who respect a vessel's power and are wary of anyone who seems to be testing its outer edge for the sake of testing it. None of this skepticism rose to the level of public campaign or formal warning. It existed instead in the ordinary texture of a shipbuilding town's talk, at the yards, on the docks, in the modest exchanges between men who had spent years learning what a schooner could and could not be asked to do, and who now watched the drawings for the Lawson pass among them with a kind of guarded curiosity, uncertain whether they were witnessing the future of the coasting trade or a singular experiment unlikely ever to be repeated. Through that mixture of confidence, caution, and murmured doubt, the design itself gradually settled into its final and exact form. She would run, by the completed drawings, to a length near 400 feet, with a beam broad enough to give her the stability her enormous sail plan would require, and a steel hull deep enough to carry the ballast and cargo that made the coal trade worth entering in the first place. 7 masts would rise from her deck in a line, each one built and stepped to carry a single large sail, rather than the multiple smaller sails a wooden-masted ship of earlier design might have carried on the same number of sticks. A deliberate simplification meant to keep the crew required to work her within reasonable, affordable bounds. The combined sail area, when fully spread, would come to a figure large enough to be spoken of in the same breath as the largest sailing vessels then afloat. A canvas expanse meant to catch every advantage of wind the coal trade's long coastal runs could offer. Every dimension, every mast height, every span of canvas was arrived at not by guesswork, but by the patient, repeated calculation of men extending known schooner design as far into unfamiliar territory as the steel and the economics of the age would allow, watching each figure against the others until length, breadth, mast height, and sail area balanced into a single coherent shape. It was, when finished, a design without precedent in any yard's prior ledger. And it was this design, agreed upon at last after every doubt had been weighed and set quietly aside, that the workers of the Four River Yard would now begin to raise, plate by plate, into steel. The Four River Shipbuilding Company sat on the banks of the river for which it was named, a stretch of Quincy shoreline that had, in the space of a few years, gone from marsh and modest slipways to a working landscape of cranes, furnaces, and blackened timber sheds. By the time the drawings for the Seven-Masted Schooner reached the yard's floor, Four River had already built a name for itself in steel, laying down torpedo boats and steamers for a navy eager for modern hulls. It was not, in its temperament, a yard built for schooners at all. Schooners belonged to an older world of adze and oak, of shipwrights who read the grain of a timber the way a farmer reads weather. What Four River offered instead was iron rail track laid along the slipways, cranes swinging on their pivots against the sky, and the low, constant thunder of riveting that never quite stopped from the first light of morning until the whistle called the shifts to change. It was into this rhythm, mechanical, exact, indifferent to the romance of sail, that the specifications for Thomas Lawson's great vessel were delivered, to be read not as poetry, but as instruction. The keel was laid in the early months of construction, and even this first act announced how far the ship departed from everything the coasting trade had known before. Where a wooden schooner's keel was a single great bulk of oak or pine, hewn and scarfed and pinned with a craftsman's patience, the keel of this vessel was steel. Plates and bars shaped in the yard's own furnaces, cut to a curve calculated on paper long before any hand touched metal. Men who had spent years around wooden hulls, who could tell by smell alone whether a timber had been properly seasoned, watched the laying of this steel spine with a kind of wary respect. There was no grain to read, no knot to work around, only the given dimensions of the plate and the demand that it be fitted exactly, riveted exactly, so that the whole structure would carry a load no wooden keel could have borne. The keel went down in sections lowered by crane, aligned by men calling adjustments back and forth over the noise of the yard, and bolted into place with a permanence that belonged to the century just beginning rather than the one just ending. It was not lost on anyone in the yard or in the town beyond it that barely a mile or two along the coast, other schooners were still being built in the old way. Wooden vessels, 3-masted, sometimes 4, rose on slipways not far from Four River's steel giant, their frames the color of raw timber, their builders working with axe, auger, and steam-bent rib rather than furnace and rivet gun. The two worlds did not so much collide as sit side by side, a visible seam between eras. A visitor walking the Quincy shoreline in those months could pass from one yard to the next and watch within the space of an afternoon the entire history of American shipbuilding laid open, the adze-shaped oak frame of a coasting schooner in one yard, and in the next, a steel hull whose ribs were being raised by crane and closed with rivets, larger than any wooden vessel that had ever swum in American waters. Sailors and yard workers alike remarked on it, some with pride, some with an unease they did not always put into words. Iron and steel had already conquered the ocean-going steamer. Here, now, it was reaching into sail itself, into the wooden trade that coasting families had carried for generations, and reshaping it into something they scarcely recognized. The labor required to raise such a hull was not the labor of a single trade, but of many, coordinated across months in a rhythm the yard's foreman had learned to conduct like a kind of industrial orchestra. Foundries elsewhere in Quincy and beyond cast and rolled the plates and bars to specification, shipping them to the yard by rail and cart, where riggers and cranemen took over, swinging each piece into place along the rising skeleton of the hull. Riveters worked in teams, a heater tending a small coal forge that kept rivets glowing orange, a catcher who tossed the hot rivet with tongs to a holder-on positioned inside the hull, and two men outside driving it home with hammers. The whole sequence repeated thousands upon thousands of times until the sound of it became less like industry and more like weather, a constant metallic rain that the town of Quincy learned to live inside. Draftsmen and loftsmen worked in a separate quiet from all this noise, translating the naval architect's calculations into full-sized patterns laid out on the floor of the mold loft. Patterns that were then transferred to steel and cut with a precision no eye alone could have managed. The foremen who oversaw this work were, in their way, as central to the story as the men who had drawn the design. It was they who translated dimension into sequence, deciding which plate went up before which team of riveters worked which section of hull, how the great curve of the vessel's flank was to be built up course by course without ever losing the fairness of her lines. For River's foremen had cut their experience on steamers and torpedo boats, vessels of speed and armament, and now found themselves shepherding into being something else entirely. A sailing vessel of unprecedented size, built with the tools and methods of the modern steel trade. There was, among some of them, a quiet pride in this, a sense that whatever else the yard built in the years to come, it would be remembered for having raised this hull first, for having proven that steel construction could be extended into a rigged sailing vessel on a scale no wooden yard could have attempted. That pride showed itself in small ways, in the care taken over a seam that might otherwise have been rushed, in the foreman's habit of walking the length of the hull each evening before the whistle blew, checking with his own eye what the drawings had already confirmed on paper, simply because the scale of the thing demanded a kind of vigilance beyond what smaller vessels required. The hull rose slowly, as such things must, patience being the only rate at which steel of this size could safely be closed into shape. First came the ribs, steel frames spaced along the length of the keel, curving up and out to define the vessel's great breadth, standing for a time like the exposed skeleton of some creature not yet clothed in skin. Workers moved among these frames with a strange freedom, walking along temporary staging inside a shape that was, for weeks, more air than substance, the river visible through gaps that would soon be sealed forever. Then, plate by plate, the shell began to close over them. Each plate was fitted, drilled, and riveted in its place, the work proceeding along the hull in a slow migration from bow towards stern, until what had been an open cage of steel became, section by section, a solid and continuous surface, smooth from the outside, ribbed and riveted within, closing over the frames the way a shell closes over the soft creature it protects. Watching this process from the yard's edge, one could see the vessel's true size begin to declare itself in a way the drawings never quite managed. The hull did not merely grow longer, it grew taller, wider, more absolute, until it dwarfed the sheds and cranes around it, until men working at its base looked, from a distance, like figures sketched in for scale rather than workers with tools in their hands. By the time the hull neared completion, there was a change in the way the yard spoke of the vessel. It was no longer discussed simply as a job, a contract, a set of drawings to be executed and delivered. Among the riveters and riggers, among the foremen who checked the seams each evening, there had settled a quiet, unspoken recognition that they were raising something the sea itself had not yet been asked to carry. A steel hull of a length and breadth that belonged by every precedent to the steamer trade, now being fitted out instead for sail, for 7 towering masts that had not yet been stepped, but were already spoken of in the yard with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. No one in Quincy had built anything like it before. No one, so far as the records of any yard could show, had built anything like it anywhere. That knowledge moved through the workforce the way weather moves through a harbor, not announced, but felt in the extra care taken over a rivet, in the pride with which a foreman gestured at the rising steel wall of the hull when a visitor came to look, in the sense, growing steadily through the months of construction, that when this vessel finally left the yard, it would carry Four Rivers' name into a kind of history no torpedo boat or coastal steamer ever could. Once the hull itself had taken its full shape, riveted and plated into the long steel vessel that would eventually stretch further than most buildings of the age reached upward, the work turned skyward. 7 masts remained to be raised, and this, more than the plating of the hull or the fitting of the deck, was the labor that made the men at the yard pause in what they were doing and simply look. A ship with 2 masts was common enough to draw no comment. A ship with 4 or 5 had been seen along this coast within living memory, schooners built for the same coal and lumber trades that would eventually claim the Lawson herself. But 7 masts, rising in a row from a single steel hull, was a sight that no one at Four River, and likely no one on the Atlantic seaboard, had ever been asked to build before. The sailors who would eventually crew her did what sailors have always done with things too large or too strange to be trusted to plain numbers. They gave the masts names. It was an old habit of the sea, born of the same instinct that led ships themselves to be christened rather than merely registered, and it served a practical purpose as much as a superstitious one. A number could be misheard in the wind and rain of a storm at night, one syllable lost against the shriek of rigging, but a name, repeated in the particular cadence of a ship's crew, carried further and stuck more firmly in memory. On a vessel where a shouted order might mean the difference between a sail properly trimmed and a spar snapped loose in a gale, that kind of certainty mattered. The names the crew settled upon ran from bow to stern in a simple, almost domestic litany. Fore, main, mizzen, and then onward through spanker, jigger, driver, and pusher, though the exact sequence and terms varied somewhat depending on which sailor was asked and in which year. What mattered was not the precision of the list, but the pattern behind it. A chain of names that let a man standing on deck in the dark orient himself instantly, counting forward or aft along a mental ladder of familiar words rather than trying to hold 7 identical numbers in his head while the ship pitched beneath him. Forward to aft, the names moved like a roll call, and a sailor newly signed aboard was expected to learn them within his first days, the way he might learn the names of shipmates he would soon depend on for his life. For the men who built and rigged her, though, the names came second to a harder problem. How do you calculate the tension and balance of standing rigging on a ship with no precedent to measure against? A schooner's masts are not simply planted and left to stand on their own strength. Each one is held upright by a web of steel and rope, stays running forward and aft, shrouds running to either side, every line calculated to share the load of wind pressing against acres of canvas, so that no single mast bears more strain than its steel can hold. On a conventional schooner, generations of shipwrights had refined this calculation through trial, error, and slow accumulated habit, until the proportions of rope to mast to sail became almost second nature to an experienced rigger. But there was no such accumulated habit for a ship of 7 masts. Every angle of every stay, every degree by which one mast's rigging might interact with its neighbors, had to be worked out freshly, with no older 7-masted vessel to consult and no failed 7-masted vessel to learn from. Only the engineer's best understanding of stress and steel stretched across a problem no one had faced in quite this shape before. The riggers who climbed those masts in the weeks that followed did their work with the particular concentration of men who know that a mistake in their trade rarely announces itself until the worst possible moment, at sea, in wind, far from any yard that could correct it. They set the shrouds and stays in careful sequence, checking and rechecking the tension against gauges and against the older, more intuitive test of feel, the give of a line under a gloved hand, the sound a properly tensioned stay made when struck, faint and clear, like a plucked string far too large for any instrument. Slowly, mast by mast, the rigging closed itself into a single interconnected structure. 7 towers of steel bound together by a lattice of cable that would, if all had been calculated rightly, allow the ship to carry an almost unthinkable spread of canvas without tearing herself apart under her own power. That spread of canvas raised a second problem, quieter than the engineering of the masts themselves, but just as pressing. How could so few hands manage so much sail? A conventional schooner of modest size might carry a crew sufficient to haul each sheet and halyard by main strength, muscle multiplied by the number of men available on deck. But the Lawson's owners had built her in part on the promise that steel and scale could replace some portion of that muscle, that a vessel this size need not carry a crew to match her size if the right mechanical aids were fitted to do the heavier work. The answer came in the form of donkey engines, small steam-driven machines installed at points around the deck, their boilers fed by the same coal the ship would eventually carry as cargo, their modest power harnessed through winches and gears to haul halyards and work anchors that would otherwise have demanded dozens of extra hands. It was an arrangement that made a certain hard commercial sense, and it was also, in its way, a quiet admission of how far the ship had outrun the old assumptions of her trade. A schooner rigged this way could be sailed, in theory, by a crew smaller than her tonnage would ordinarily suggest, and a smaller crew meant a smaller wage bill, and a smaller wage bill meant, in the arithmetic that had driven the whole project from its first sketch, a better return against every ton of coal she carried south along the coast. The donkey engines hissing quietly at their stations were not simply a convenience. They were part of the ship's whole reason for existing, mechanical proof that a vessel this vast could still be made to answer economically to a crew of modest size, so long as steam did the lifting that muscle no longer could. Whether that arrangement would hold under the real strain of a real storm, no one at the yard could yet say with certainty, and the question would not be answered until the ship had left the calm water of the river behind her. But in the meantime, the masts rose, one after another, set into their steps with the same patient care that had gone into every plate of the hull, until at last, on a particular evening that no single account bothered to date precisely, the work was done, and 7 masts stood in a row above a steel hull still resting quietly on her cradle in the yard. There must have been a moment, though no photograph captures it and no letter describes it in quite the words one might wish for, when the yard workers stepped back from whatever task had occupied them and simply looked up. 7 masts ranked in careful diminishing order, their rigging catching whatever light the evening offered, standing over the whole yard like something between a ship and a small forest of steel. Men who had spent their whole working lives among schooners of 2 masts or 3, who had rigged coastal steamers and fishing boats and thought themselves familiar with every shape a sailing vessel could take, found themselves looking at something the trade had never asked them to imagine before. It was, by every account that survives even second-hand, a sight that drew silence before it drew comment. The particular hush of men recognizing that they had built something outside the ordinary run of their lives. The ship herself, for all this, was not yet finished. She rested still in her cradle at the edge of the yard, her hull complete, her 7 masts stepped and rigged, her decks fitted with the machinery that would let so few hands manage so much sail. And yet, she had not touched the water that would decide in the end whether all this calculation had been sound. She waited there through the last weeks of her construction, the way every great vessel waits before her launch, patient and enormous and untested, a giant built entirely on land, holding within her steel frame a question that only the sea itself could finally answer. To describe her whole was to describe something that resisted the ordinary language of ships, and yet the measurements existed, plain and exact, and it was in those numbers that her strangeness first became clear. She stretched 375 feet from bow to stern, a length that placed her among the longest sailing vessels ever built, and her beam ran 50 feet across, broad enough to give her hull the deep, capacious belly her owner had demanded. Her depth reached just over 35 feet, and when her tonnage was finally calculated, it came to more than 5,000 tons, a figure that would have seemed impossible for a sailing vessel only a generation before. These were not numbers meant to astonish. They were the plain facts of a working ship, arrived at through the same careful arithmetic that had shaped every merchant vessel before her, and yet placed together, they described something that had never existed in quite this form. A hull built not for speed or grace, but for sheer accommodation, for the patient carrying of enormous weight across enormous distance. It was the deck, more than any single measurement, that gave visitors to the yard their first true sense of her scale. To walk her deck from bow to stern was to walk a distance that felt less like the deck of a ship and more like a street, a long steel avenue running the length of a city block, broken at intervals by the rising trunks of her 7 masts and the low steel houses that sheltered her crew. Sailors who came aboard in those early days, men who had spent their lives on schooners with 2 or 3 masts and decks a fraction of this length, found the walk from the forward house to the wheel at her stern to be a genuine journey, and it was said, half in jest and half in something closer to awe, that a man might do well to keep a bicycle aboard simply to cross from one end of her to the other in reasonable time. The joke had some truth in it. Her deck was flat and largely unbroken, built of steel plate rather than the wooden planking of older vessels, and it ran on and on beneath a sky crowded with rigging, so vast that a sailor standing at her bow could not always make out in poor light the men working at her stern. Above that deck rose the feature that made her unlike any vessel before or since, the 7 masts that gave her both her name and her strangeness. They stood in a long, even line down the length of her hull, steel poles rather than the wooden masts of older ships, each one carrying a single enormous 4-sided sail rigged in the schooner fashion, without the yards and topsails of a square rigger, so that from a distance her silhouette read almost as a repeating pattern, mast after mast after mast, each one nearly identical to the one before it. Her owner and her designers had given each mast its own name, drawn in order from the letters of the alphabet, so that a sailor speaking of trouble aloft might refer to the fore, the main, the mizzen, and onward through masts that older schooners had never needed names for at all, simply because no schooner before her had carried enough of them to require such care in naming. Each mast stood roughly 193 feet from deck to top, tall enough that a man looking up from her deck saw the same dizzying height he might have found aboard a proper square-rigged ship, though here that height repeated itself 7 times over, a forest of steel rising above a single steel hull. The sail plan that this arrangement produced was, by any measure, immense. She carried 25 sails in total when fully rigged, a great spread of canvas that included not only the 7 principal sails set upon her 7 masts, but also the staysails rigged between them, along with jibs set forward and a spanker aft, so that when she was fully dressed for a fair wind, her canvas covered an area that dwarfed anything a conventional schooner might carry. The combined acreage of sail was said to run to more than 43,000 square feet, an expanse of canvas that, spread flat, would have covered a substantial stretch of open ground, and the ambition behind that number was plain enough. She had been built to carry a fortune in bulk cargo across open water using the wind alone, without the coal-fired engines that steamships required, and to do so with a crew far smaller than her size would ordinarily demand. That was the entire logic of her design. The reason her masts had multiplied to 7 rather than staying at 5 or 6, since dividing her sail plan across more masts meant each individual sail could remain small enough for a handful of men to handle using the steam-powered winches installed at her deck, machinery that did the work older schooners had required whole crews of able seamen to perform by hand. Below that vast deck, hidden from the eyes of anyone standing at the yard, lay the holds that gave the whole vessel its purpose. They ran nearly the full length of her hull, cavernous steel compartments built to swallow bulk cargo in quantities that dwarfed the capacity of older wooden schooners, and it was easy enough, standing above them in those final weeks, to imagine what would eventually settle into their depths. Coal, loaded loose and heavy, filling the holds until her waterline sank low and steady beneath the weight. Later, when her working life carried her into a different trade, oil, carried in bulk within tanks fitted into that same enormous hollow space, a cargo her builders had perhaps not fully imagined when they first drew her lines, but one her holds could accommodate all the same. The scale of that cargo space was, in its own way, as remarkable as her masts. She had been built to move bulk commodities across the coastal trade in quantities that made older vessels look modest by comparison. And it was in that hidden volume below her deck, more than in her rigging above it, that her owner's true ambition lay, the simple calculation that a ship large enough could move enough coal in a single voyage to make her worth every dollar spent on her construction. And yet, for all that size, the machinery meant to run her was almost startlingly modest. Her wheelhouse stood near her stern, a small steel structure housing the wheel and the instruments by which her master would guide 375 feet of steel through open water, a space no larger than what might have served a far smaller vessel. And nearby stood the crew's quarters, similarly modest, built to house not the great crowd of sailors that her size might have suggested, but a company of only around 16 men, a number that would have seemed absurd aboard any square-rigged ship of comparable tonnage, but that her steam winches and her carefully divided sail plan made possible. It was, in its way, the strangest fact about her, stranger even than her 7 masts, that so few men were meant to carry so much ship across open water, and it spoke to the particular gamble her owner had made, betting that machinery and clever engineering could substitute for the small armies of sailors that older vessels had required, that a handful of men working her deck winches could manage sails and rigging that would once have demanded 3 or 4 times their number. By the time all of this stood finished, she rested complete in her cradle at the edge of the yard, a steel leviathan waiting for the water that would decide her fate, unlike anything that had come before her and, as it would turn out, unlike anything that would ever be built again in quite this form. Her hull caught the light along its full length, her 7 masts stood in their patient line against the sky, and her decks, empty now of the coal and oil that would one day fill her holds, stretched out flat and silent, waiting for the crew who would one day walk them, and for the sea that alone could tell whether the whole vast calculation of her design had been sound. On the morning set for the launch, the yard along the Fore River filled slowly with people who had come, most of them simply to see. Word had travelled through Quincy, and beyond, that a ship unlike any other was ready to touch water for the first time, and curiosity had done what curiosity always does. It had drawn a crowd larger than the yard's ordinary business ever attracted. Men left their shops for an hour. Families walked down from the town with children on their shoulders. Sailors who had spent their lives on schooners of 2 masts, or 3, or at most 4, came to see what 7 looked like standing together, and to judge for themselves whether the rumors they had heard in taverns and along the docks bore any relation to the truth. Some had heard she was longer than certain steamships. Others had heard her masts numbered so many that no one could agree on a name for what she was. The crowd that gathered at the edge of the yard that morning was not there for spectacle in the way a circus draws a crowd. It was there because a thing had been built that did not fit into any category anyone knew, and people wished, in the plain and ordinary way that people always wish, to see it with their own eyes before they would believe it. The work of the morning belonged, as it always does at a launch, to the men who understood the ways beneath the hull better than anyone standing at the rail above them. The shipwrights had spent the preceding days preparing the launching ways with the same unhurried care they had given to every frame and plate before it. Tallow and soap had been worked into the wood in heavy coats, layer upon layer, until the surface beneath the hull's cradle held a slickness that would, when the moment came, allow 2,500 tons of steel to move under nothing but its own weight and the pull of the earth beneath it. The blocks and shores that had held her upright through the long months of construction were checked one final time, tapped with mallets, marked and rechecked, because a miscalculation at this stage could undo every careful measurement that had preceded it. Foremen walked the length of the ways with the particular quiet of men who have done this before and know that quiet is what the moment calls for. There was no urgency in their movements, only the steady attentiveness of people completing a task they respected. Somewhere in that unhurried procession of final checks lay the entire difference between a launch that succeeded and one that ended in disaster. And every man who had built her understood that as plainly as he understood his own name. When at last the signal was given, the great chocks that held her were driven free, and for a moment nothing happened at all. It is often this way with launches of great size. The hull seems for an instant to consider its own release, poised between the yard that made it and the water that would receive it, before gravity and the greased ways beneath it settled the question. Then, slowly, with a low sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself rather than from the ship, the hull began to move. It did not lunge. It did not rush toward the river the way a smaller vessel might, eager to be free of the land. It slid instead with the patient, deliberate motion of something too large to hurry, gathering speed by degrees, its shadow sweeping across the packed crowd of onlookers as it went. The seven masts, still unrigged, swayed with a barely perceptible motion as the hull beneath them shifted from the fixed stability of the yard to the first suggestion of the buoyancy that would define the whole of her working life. For those who stood close enough to feel it, there was a tremor in the ground itself, a vibration that traveled up through boots and boards alike, the report of steel and gravity announcing that something enormous had at last begun to move. It was in this moment, as the hull touched the water and the river rose to take her weight for the first time, that the name Thomas W. Lawson was spoken aloud in its intended context. No longer a name attached to blueprints and ledgers, no longer a name spoken only in the offices of the company that had ordered her built, but a name now fastened to 2,500 tons of steel resting, at last, upon the water for which she had been designed. The christening was brief, as these things generally were, without excessive ceremony, matching the plain and functional character of the vessel herself. She had not been built for pageantry, and her launch did not pretend otherwise. But there was something in the plainness of it that suited her, a working ship, named for a man of considerable ambition, entering the water without more fuss than the occasion required, and yet entering it, undeniably, as something the likes of which the river had never carried before. The newspapers of the following days took up the story with the appetite such novelty deserved. Accounts of her launch spread beyond the immediate region, carried by wire services to papers in cities that had no particular stake in the Fore River or in Quincy's shipbuilding trade, but that recognized a curiosity when one presented itself. Writers reached for comparisons that would mean something to readers who had never seen a schooner of any size, and the comparison that recurred most often was to steamships. Vessels of a type the public had come to associate with true bigness, with the modern scale of ocean commerce. That a sailing vessel, rigged with canvas and masts in the old tradition, could rival such ships in length and tonnage struck many correspondents as worth remarking upon at length. And they did so, filling columns with descriptions of her 7 masts, her steel hull, her holds capacious enough to carry more coal than anyone had thought a schooner could reasonably hold. The tone of these accounts was less alarm than fascination, a sense that shipbuilding had produced something genuinely new, an oddity of engineering that deserved to be seen and discussed rather than merely logged in a registry. For Thomas W. Lawson himself, the man whose name now rode the water at Quincy, the launch carried a weight beyond the merely ceremonial. He had put his money and his reputation into a vessel built on a theory that economy of scale, applied to sail rather than steam, might yet produce a profit where conventional wisdom said none could be found. Whatever pride he took in seeing his name affixed to so singular an object was, by all evidence of his character, inseparable from the plainer satisfaction of a financier watching a considerable investment finally begin to justify itself. The ship in the water was no longer a projection on paper or a set of figures in a ledger. She was a physical fact now, however unproven her working life might yet turn out to be, and Lawson had every reason to feel that the gamble he had backed had at least cleared its first and most literal hurdle. Whether she would earn back what she had cost, whether the theory beneath her construction would hold up against the plain difficulties of handling 7 masts at sea, remained questions the launch itself could not answer. But she floated, and for a man who had staked so much on the wager that she would, that fact alone was cause enough for a quiet, private satisfaction. Once clear of the ways and settled fully into the river's hold, she was taken in tow by smaller vessels and guided toward the fitting-out berth where the remaining work of her construction would continue. Her masts stood bare against the sky still, awaiting the rigging that would, in time, give her the full and finished silhouette by which she would become known along the coast. Her decks remained empty of the machinery and gear that her working life would require. She was, in this interval between launch and completion, neither wholly a ship nor merely a hull, a vessel afloat but not yet alive in the sense that a ship becomes alive once crewed and rigged and sent to sea. The crowd that had gathered to watch her slide into the water dispersed gradually back into the ordinary business of the day, carrying with them the story of what they had seen, while behind them, at her berth, the work of finishing her began in earnest, patient, and exacting as everything that had come before it. The work of finishing the Thomas W. Lawson proceeded through the closing weeks of the summer of 1902, with the same unhurried thoroughness that had marked her construction. A launched hull, however impressive to the crowds who had watched her take the water, remained a long way from a working ship. Riggers came aboard in the days that followed to begin the slow accumulation of gear that would transform her from an empty steel shell into something capable of crossing an ocean under sail. It was work that could not be rushed, for a vessel of her size demanded rigging on a scale that had never been assembled before, and every fitting, every length of wire and chain had to be tested and proven before it could be trusted to hold. The masts themselves, 7 in number and each rising higher than most ships of the age carried even a single spar, were fitted in sequence rather than all at once. Riggers worked mast by mast, hoisting the lower yards and setting the standing rigging that would keep each pole steady against the strain of wind and sail. Only when one mast had been secured and tested did the crews move on to the next, working their way down the deck in the same patient order that the shipwrights had followed in raising the steel frames months before. It was slow, deliberate labor, performed high above the deck on staging that swayed gently with the movement of the hull below, and the men who did it were among the few in the harbor with the particular skill required to rig a ship built at this unfamiliar scale. The sails followed the same careful sequence. Rather than bending all the canvas at once and risking confusion or damage, the riggers raised and tested each sail in turn, watching how it filled, how it drew against the mast behind it, how the sheets and halyards behaved under load. 25 sails in total would eventually dress her 7 masts, an amount of canvas that no crew before hers had been asked to manage as a single coordinated system. Each sail, tested alone, performed as expected. The question that no one could yet answer was how they would behave together. When all 25 were set at once, and the ship was asked to respond to wind from a given quarter, with the whole of her rig drawing at the same time. That question could only be answered at sea, and so, once the rigging was judged sound and the sails proven individually sound as well, the Lawson was readied for her first trials along the coast. These early trial runs carried an atmosphere unlike that of an ordinary ship's shakedown. The crew assembled for these first voyages had, for the most part, served aboard large schooners before, some with 4 masts, a few with 5, but none had commanded or crewed a vessel with 7 masts and the sail plan that came with it. The coordination required was unprecedented. A schooner's rig depends on her crew moving sail in sequence, tacking and trimming and easing sheets according to long-practiced routines developed over generations of handling 2, 3, 4 masts at most. 7 masts multiplied the complexity of every maneuver. A single tack that might take a 4-masted schooner's crew a matter of minutes to execute smoothly required, on the Lawson, careful timing across a deck that stretched further than most crews had ever worked, with commands passed down the line from mast to mast, and men stationed at intervals to manage sails they could barely see from one end of the ship to the other. It was during these trials that the vessel's particular handling qualities first became apparent, and they were qualities that gave her crew pause even as they marveled at her size. In light winds, the Lawson proved sluggish, slow to answer the helm and slow to gather speed even with her full spread of canvas drawing. Her great weight, so much of it concentrated in steel frames and the coal she was built to carry, meant that a gentle breeze which might send a smaller schooner skimming along at a respectable pace left the Lawson barely moving, her sails filled but her hull reluctant to follow. This was not entirely unexpected. A ship of her displacement required a certain minimum of wind before her mast could be set properly in motion, and sailors accustomed to lighter vessels had to adjust their expectations accordingly. More troubling, though spoken of with the same restraint that characterized most assessments of her at the time, was her behavior in gusty or shifting conditions. Where a lighter, more conventionally rigged schooner might respond quickly to a sudden increase in wind, easing pressure through her sails and rig, the Lawson answered gusts with what her crew described as an unwieldy heaviness, a tendency to heel further than expected and to recover slowly once the gust had passed. Her great length and the sheer area of canvas she carried meant that any imbalance in the wind striking her rig was magnified across a hull far longer than most sailors had experience managing. The old rules of thumb that governed how much sail to carry in a given wind, refined over decades of experience with smaller vessels, did not translate cleanly to a ship of this unprecedented scale, and her crew found themselves, in these early trials, essentially relearning seamanship for a vessel that fit no existing category. The captain, given charge of the Lawson for these trials and for her subsequent service, was Captain George W. Dow, a man with long experience in large sailing vessels and a reputation, according to the accounts that survive, for calm competence under difficult conditions. It was Dow who oversaw the trials along the coast, who watched the sails fill and empty in sequence, who felt through the helm the peculiar heaviness that distinguished the Lawson from every other vessel he had commanded. His crew, drawn largely from the ranks of experienced schooner sailors along the New England coast, approached the ship with a mixture that the sources suggest was equal parts pride and unease. There was pride in serving aboard the largest schooner ever built, in being among the first men to work her rigging and feel her respond, however sluggishly, to sail and helm. But there was also, among men who had spent their working lives reading the moods of smaller, more predictable vessels, a private wariness about a ship whose behavior did not yet fit any pattern they had learned to trust. To make her manageable at all required mechanical assistance on a scale that no wholly sail-powered vessel of the older tradition had ever needed. The Lawson was fitted with steam-driven engines dedicated not to propulsion but to handling her enormous gear. Steam windlasses hauled her anchors, driven by boilers that burned coal, drawn from her own cargo when necessary. Steam-powered winches assisted in hoisting her sails and working her larger lines, tasks that would have required an impossibly large crew if attempted by hand alone. This machinery, described by those who examined her with the same technical calm applied to the rest of her construction, represented an acknowledgement built into her very design, that a ship of this scale could not be handled by muscle and rope in the manner of schooners half her size. She required steam to assist the wind, machinery to assist the men, in order to function at all. Even with this mechanical assistance, doubts persisted among the sailors who served her in these early weeks. Some who had experience with her later spoke, in accounts that survive only in fragments and second-hand report, of a sense that her balance was not quite right, that her long, narrow hull combined with the height and spread of her rig created a vessel more sensitive to shifting loads and shifting winds than her designers had perhaps fully anticipated. These doubts were not raised as alarms. No one aboard suggested in these early trials that the ship was unsafe or unseaworthy in any immediate sense. The concerns were voiced instead in the quieter register of professional caution, the sort of assessment one sailor might offer another over the accumulated experience of a working life, remarking that she wanted careful handling, that she was not a ship to be sailed carelessly or trusted blindly in the way one might trust a smaller, more thoroughly proven vessel. What emerged from these weeks of fitting out and trial was a growing sense, shared quietly among those closest to her, that the Thomas W. Lawson was less a ship in the old tradition of sail than an experiment still in the process of proving itself. She had been built, rigged, and floated according to sound principles scaled upward from vessels that had served reliably for generations, but scale itself had introduced qualities that no smaller schooner had ever displayed, qualities that her crew was still learning to read and respond to, even as she was readied for the working life that awaited her. The trials complete, the rigging proven sound enough for service, if not fully understood in all its particulars, the Lawson was pronounced ready to begin the trade for which she had been built, and preparations began for her first entry into the coal routes along the American coast. The trade itself was without glamour, and this suited the men who had commissioned her, for glamour had never been the intention behind the seven masts, whatever the newspapers chose to make of them. Coal moved along the eastern seaboard in a steady, unromantic procession, from the loading piers of Newport News and Norfolk northward to the power plants and gasworks of Boston and Providence and the smaller ports that depended on it for heat and light, and it was into this procession that the Lawson now entered, her holds built to swallow cargo in quantities that no wooden schooner before her had ever attempted to carry. Oil moved along similar routes when the coal trade slackened, carried in bulk rather than in barrels, another commodity that asked nothing of a ship beyond capacity and the ability to deliver it intact. And the Lawson, whatever her failings might later prove to be, had capacity in abundance. She was, in this sense, precisely what she'd been designed to be. A vessel that reduced the movement of bulk goods to its simplest terms, more cargo carried by fewer hands than any comparable ship afloat, and for a time, this arithmetic seemed to justify every choice that had gone into her building. The economics that had animated Crownshield's design and Winslow's financing were not abstract principles, but figures that could be tallied voyage by voyage, and it was in this tallying that the case for the seven-masted schooner was meant to be proven. A conventional schooner of 5 masts required a crew whose wages accumulated across a season of steady work, and a 6-masted vessel required more still. But the Lawson, for all her additional canvas and additional spars, called for a crew scarcely larger than that of her 6-masted rivals, her donkey engines and steam-powered winches doing work that would otherwise have demanded dozens of additional hands hauling on halyards and sheets. Fewer men meant lower wages paid out across a voyage, and lower wages, set against a hold capacity larger than any wooden ship had carried before, promised a margin of profit that no steamer burning costly coal to move its own coal could easily match. This was the case Winslow had made to his fellow investors, the case that had justified the extraordinary expense of her construction, and for her early voyages the case appeared to hold. She carried her cargo, she paid her wages, and she returned a profit that satisfied the men who had risked their capital upon her. At sea under load, she presented a sight that those who watched her pass along the coast did not soon forget, though the men who worked her decks had little leisure to admire what they served. Loaded with coal or oil, she rode low in the water, her freeboard reduced to a modest margin above the waves, her great steel hull settling into the sea with the particular heaviness of a vessel carrying every ton she had been built to carry, and perhaps a few more besides. Above this low-laden hull, her 7 masts rose in their patient succession, and when the wind filled her sails, which numbered some 25 in total when every jib and staysail and gaff topsail was counted, she presented a spread of canvas that seemed to occupy the whole width of the horizon to a small boat passing near her. Sailors on other vessels spoke of raising her hull down against the sky and watching her masts appear one after another as she drew nearer, an experience that never entirely lost its strangeness, no matter how many times a man had already seen her pass. She was, under those conditions, a vessel that inspired the same wonder in her working years that she had inspired at her launching, though the wonder now belonged to men going about ordinary business rather than to crowds gathered for a spectacle. In calm and moderate weather she performed adequately, and adequately was, in the calculus of commercial shipping, often sufficient. She could carry her cargo across the routes she had been built for, deliver it intact and return for more, and a schooner that could do this reliably in the seas she was likely to encounter along a coastal trade route had, in the plainest sense, justified her existence regardless of what more dramatic vessels might accomplish. But adequacy in calm water was not the same as capability in every water, and it was here that the qualities Crownshield's design had introduced, qualities that scale itself had produced and that no smaller schooner had ever displayed, began to make themselves felt in ways that mattered. In heavy weather, the Lawson did not handle as her crew might have wished. She was slow to answer her helm, her great length and her low, heavily laden hull resisting the quick response that a smaller vessel could offer, and her enormous spread of canvas distributed across 7 masts rather than concentrated in fewer larger sails. created a rigging system whose stresses under strain were difficult to predict and harder still to manage once a storm had begun to test them. Men who sailed her spoke of a vessel that felt sluggish when quickness was wanted, that leaned into a following sea in ways that unsettled those who had learned their trade on more conventional ships, and that demanded from her crew a constant, wary attention that smaller schooners, for all their own dangers, did not require in quite the same measure. She was not alone in this trade, and it is worth remembering that the years of her service were also the last great years of the multi-masted schooner as a category, a period in which a handful of extraordinary wooden and steel vessels competed for the same routes and the same cargoes, each one pushing against the practical limits of what sail could still accomplish before steam closed over the trade entirely. Six-masted schooners, such as the Eleanor A. Percy and the William L. Douglas, worked the same coal fields and the same northern ports, vessels scarcely less remarkable than the Lawson herself, if less remarked upon precisely because they lacked her singular seventh mast. And among these rivals and near equals, the Lawson held her place as the largest and the strangest, but not always the most reliable or the most economical performer. Her crews had their own respect for the smaller six-masted ships, which handled with a fraction of the trouble and carried cargo not far short of what the Lawson herself could manage, and there were men on the coal piers who wondered aloud whether the seventh mast had earned its keep or simply given the shipping papers something new to write about. There was, in the routes she sailed and the cargo she carried, a quiet irony that few among her crew or her owners seemed to have remarked upon at the time, though it would not have escaped a more reflective observer. The Lawson had been built, at least in part, as an argument, a demonstration that sail could still compete against steam if only the economics of scale were pushed far enough. And yet the very trade she now served, the movement of coal along the American coast, was among the trades in which steam was making its advance most rapidly and most permanently. She sailed her routes past steamers burning coal to carry coal, a spectacle whose contradictions Winslow himself may have appreciated even as he balanced his ledgers. For a steamship's fuel costs were real and considerable, and the seven-masted schooner's freedom from them remained, whatever her handling troubles, a genuine advantage on paper. But steam was advancing not only in efficiency, but in reliability and speed, in the certainty of arrival that shippers increasingly valued over the raw economics of tonnage carried per dollar spent, and every year that the Lawson worked her coal routes was a year in which the world she had been built to argue for was quietly receding, mast by mast, from the world that was actually taking shape along the coast she sailed. For a span of years, though, none of this troubled the steady, unspectacular rhythm of her service. She loaded, she sailed, she delivered, she returned, and the men who owned her found in this rhythm the profit they had hoped for, modest but real, sufficient to justify the extraordinary sum her construction had demanded. She became, in this period, less a wonder than a fixture, a familiar shape along the coastal routes whose passing drew less comment with each season that she continued her work without catastrophe. Sailors grew accustomed to her strangeness. Dock workers loaded her without particular ceremony, and the newspapers that had once filled columns with wonder at her seven masts now mentioned her, when they mentioned her at all, in the same brief notices given to any other vessel arriving or departing with cargo. This was, in its way, a kind of achievement, the achievement of the ordinary, and it might have continued for years longer than it did had the routes she sailed remained confined to the calm and moderate waters of the American coastal trade for which she had, whatever her faults, proven herself at least adequately suited. But calm before what was to come is rarely recognized as such while it lasts, and the years of steady coal-carrying service that the Lawson gave her owners were, though no one aboard her could have known it, drawing toward a voyage unlike any she had yet made. Among the men who sailed her, and among the many more who merely watched her pass, the Thomas W. Lawson had by now acquired a reputation that no builder's boast and no owner's balance sheet could entirely dispel. She was spoken of, in the quiet way that sailors speak of things they do not fully trust, as a ship that demanded more than she gave back. This was not a judgment made in anger or in haste. It accumulated slowly, voyage by voyage, in the manner that most maritime reputations are made, through small failures repeated often enough that they cease to seem like accidents and begin to seem like character. A ship, sailors have always believed, has a temperament of her own, separate from the wood or steel of her making, and the temperament attributed to the Lawson, however unfairly or fairly, was one of difficulty, of stubbornness, of a vessel that had been built for record rather than for ease, and that never quite forgot which purpose had come first. The complaints, when set down plainly, were not dramatic. They were the complaints of men who had to work a ship day after day and who found her, in the particulars that mattered most to them, harder than she needed to be. She was slow to answer her helm. This was perhaps the most persistent grievance and the most consequential. A schooner's safety depended in no small part on her ability to respond when her wheel was turned, to come up into the wind or fall away from it within a reasonable span of time, so that her crew could anticipate her movements and trust her to behave as commanded. The Lawson, by every account that survives from those who steered her, did not behave this way. She was heavy in her response, sluggish in translating the turn of her wheel into a change in her heading, so that a helmsman might correct for a shift in the wind, only to find some considerable time later that the ship had barely begun to comply, and that the correction now needed correcting in turn. On a smaller vessel, this delay would have been an inconvenience. On the Lawson, with her enormous mass and her sails spread across 7 towering masts, the delay became something closer to a hazard, a gap between intention and result, into which trouble could and occasionally did slip. She was also, by the testimony of those who served aboard her, prone to rolling in ways that unsettled even experienced deep-water men. A ship's roll is a natural consequence of her design, of the shape of her hull and the distribution of her weight, and every vessel rolls to some degree in a following sea or a beam wind. But the roll attributed to the Lawson was described in the accounts that have come down through the recollections of her crew as unusually deep and unusually sudden, a motion that seemed to arrive without the warning that experienced sailors relied upon to brace themselves and secure what needed securing. Some among those who studied her afterward suggested that this tendency arose from the very feature that made her remarkable: the great spread of sail carried aloft on 7 masts, which raised her center of effort high above her deck and made her more sensitive than a shorter-rigged vessel to the shifting pressures of wind and wave. Whether this explanation was entirely correct or only partially so, the sailors who felt the deck tilt beneath them did not much concern themselves with the physics. They simply learned, as sailors learn, to be wary of a ship that rolled in ways they could not predict, and they carried that wariness with them when they spoke of her in the boarding houses and taverns of the ports she visited. There were, in these years, no catastrophes to report, no wrecks or great losses that might have given the Lawson's reputation a dramatic anchor. What there were, instead, were the smaller incidents that accumulate around any working vessel over years of service. The kind that rarely make their way into formal record, but that live on in the memory of a crew and in the stories passed between ships. A spar strained under sudden pressure. A sail torn loose before it could be properly secured, flogging dangerously in the wind until hands could be found to subdue it. A near collision in crowded coastal waters, avoided by margins that felt, to those aboard, uncomfortably narrow. None of these moments taken alone distinguished the Lawson from any other large sailing vessel of her era, for such incidents were the ordinary hazards of a trade that had never been without risk. But taken together and set against the particular difficulties of her steering and her roll, they formed a pattern that men who worked ships were quick to notice and slow to forget. A vessel that handled poorly was a vessel that made every ordinary hazard slightly more dangerous than it needed to be, and sailors who trusted their instincts in these matters more than they trusted any owner's assurances drew their own conclusions. There is a tension worth sitting with here between the scale that made the Lawson famous and the practical burdens that scale imposed upon her. She had been built to be the largest, the first and only of her kind, a vessel whose 7 masts announced an ambition that no other builder had dared to attempt. This ambition had succeeded in its way. She was and remained a genuine wonder, a ship that drew crowds to the waterfront wherever she called, and that carried in her very silhouette a boast no other schooner could make. But the qualities that made her a wonder to look at were not always the qualities that made her a pleasure or even a reliable proposition to sail. Her great size required great quantities of canvas, and great quantities of canvas required more hands to manage than her owners had judged practical to carry, given the labor-saving devices installed to reduce her crew. Her towering rig, so impressive from the shore, created handling burdens that a smaller vessel would never have known. She was, in short, a ship whose triumph and whose trouble sprang from the very same source, and this is not, when one considers the wider history of shipbuilding, a coincidence confined to her alone. It is a pattern that recurs quietly but persistently across the long record of maritime ambition. The largest vessels of any age, the ones built to exceed all precedent, to claim a record that no rival could match, have often proven the hardest to master in practice. There is a kind of arithmetic at work in this pattern, though it is rarely spoken of in such terms by the men who build or sail these ships. Scale brings advantages, certainly, in cargo carried and in the pride taken by owners and by nations. But scale also brings burdens that do not increase in simple proportion to the size of the hull. A larger ship requires more canvas, more rigging, more hands to manage the increased complexity, and these requirements often outrun what the ship's design, however clever, can fully accommodate. The largest ships of an era are frequently, therefore, also its most difficult ships. Vessels whose crews learn to work around limitations that no amount of engineering skill entirely eliminates. The Lawson's reputation for trouble, in this light, was not a mark of failure unique to her builders or her design. It was rather a familiar cost paid by any vessel that reaches for a record no one has yet claimed, a cost that the history of great ships pays again and again in different forms across different centuries. None of this, it should be said, was spoken of aboard the Lawson or in the offices of her owners with any great sense of alarm. She continued to sail, to load her coal, to make her runs along the coast with the same steady regularity she had shown since her earliest voyages. The complaints of her crew were the ordinary complaints of working men aboard a working ship, voiced in passing, absorbed into the routine of the trade, and rarely committed to paper with any weight of foreboding. And yet, when the story of the Lawson's final years came later to be told, those who told it found themselves returning, almost without meaning to these small and scattered details: the slow helm, the sudden roll, the strained gear and the narrow escapes, and arranging them, in retrospect, into something that looked from a sufficient distance very much like warning. Whether such warnings were ever truly there, or whether they were only assembled afterward by minds seeking a pattern in what had, in truth, been ordinary misfortune, is a question the record cannot fully answer. What can be said is that the ship, which had been built to be unlike any other, now carried, in the quiet talk of the men who knew her best, a reputation that made her unlike any other in a different and more troubling sense, and that this reputation would not remain untested for very much longer. By 1907, the Thomas W. Lawson had been carrying coal along the American coast for 3 years, moving between the ports of the eastern seaboard in the manner for which she had been built, her 7 masts catching whatever wind the coastal weather offered, her long steel hull settling into the routines of a trade that asked nothing more of her than endurance and capacity. She had earned by then the wary respect that difficult ships often earn, admired for her size, discussed for her handling, watched by men who had learned not to take her lightly. But she had not, in all that time, been asked to cross an ocean. Her voyages had kept close to land, from one American harbor to another, never far from a coastline that could, if needed, offer shelter. This would change with a single charter arranged that year by the Sun Oil Company, which sought a vessel capable of carrying a bulk cargo of oil across the Atlantic to London, and which found in the Lawson a hull large enough and available enough to answer the need. It was, on its surface, an ordinary commercial arrangement, the kind struck 1,000 times a year in the coal and oil trades of the period. It would prove, in the case of this particular ship, to be anything but ordinary in its consequences. The voyage that resulted was unlike anything the Lawson had yet attempted. She had been designed from her earliest conception as a coastal carrier. a ship meant to move heavy cargo cheaply along familiar routes. Her great size an advantage in calm or moderate waters where her limited maneuverability posed little danger. Her 7 masts and their modest sail area suited to steady following winds rather than the sustained and unpredictable weather of the open sea. Crossing the Atlantic asked something different of her. It asked her to hold together against swells that built over thousands of miles of open water, to answer her helm in conditions her designers had not fully anticipated, and to do all of this far from any port that might offer quick refuge should trouble arise. Whether her builders, had they been asked, would have recommended such a crossing is a question the record does not preserve an answer to. What is known is that the charter was accepted, the cargo was arranged, and the ship that had spent her working life within sight of the American coast was made ready to leave it behind for the first time. Command of the Lawson for this voyage was given to Captain George Dow, a mariner experienced in the handling of large sailing vessels, chosen for a passage that would demand steady judgment rather than daring. The accounts that survive describe him without embellishment, a professional seaman entrusted with a difficult ship on an unfamiliar route, a man whose competence was not in question even as the ship beneath him carried a reputation for being unpredictable in ways that competence alone could not always answer for. Alongside him sailed a crew of some 16 men, their names preserved only partially in the surviving records, ordinary sailors engaged for wages in a trade that offered little glamour and considerable risk. Men who understood the nature of the ship they served without necessarily understanding what this particular crossing would ask of them. A single passenger is also recorded as having joined the voyage, a representative of the charter arrangement traveling to observe the delivery of the cargo, a detail that would later take on its own quiet weight in the story of what followed. Together, this small company of men prepared to take the largest schooner ever built across an ocean she had not been built to cross. The cargo itself was loaded at Philadelphia, where the ship took on a full hold of kerosene, packed not in barrels but carried in bulk within her tanks, a modern method for the period and one suited to a vessel of her enormous carrying capacity. The loading proceeded through the ordinary rhythms of a working port. Lines run from shore installations to the ship's tanks, the cargo measured and recorded, the crew occupied with the countless small tasks that preceded any departure of consequence. Philadelphia in that season offered nothing unusual in the way of weather or omen. The accounts describe a routine loading, unremarkable in every particular, the kind of departure preparation that had been repeated at that port 1,000 times before and would be repeated 1,000 times again. If there was any sense among the men involved that this crossing differed meaningfully from the coastal runs the ship was accustomed to, it does not survive in any record left behind. The cargo was loaded, the paperwork completed, and the ship made ready to sail with the same unhurried competence that attended any large commercial departure of the period. The departure itself, when it came, was equally unremarkable, and it is worth pausing on this fact because it would be tempting, knowing what followed, to describe that departure as shadowed by foreboding, to find in the ordinary business of casting off some intimation of the disaster that lay ahead. The historical record does not support such a reading. The ship left Philadelphia in conditions that gave no particular cause for concern, her crew going about their duties with the unremarkable focus of men beginning a long voyage, her captain attending to the countless details that fell to him with the calm professionalism his record suggests he possessed. There is no account of unusual hesitation among the crew, no note of a captain troubled by doubts he could not name, no gathering of dark clouds beyond whatever ordinary weather attended an autumn departure from an American port. The Lawson simply sailed, as ships do, carrying her cargo and her crew toward a destination that lay at that moment comfortably beyond the horizon, her 7 masts filling with wind in the manner they had filled 100 times before, her great steel hull settling into the long roll of open water as she left the coast behind her. The crossing that followed asked of the ship exactly what might have been expected of any vessel making the passage from an American port to England in that season. A long stretch of open Atlantic sailing, weeks of steady progress interrupted by the ordinary variations of wind and weather that any transatlantic voyage produced. But for the Lawson, accustomed to the more sheltered rhythms of coastal work, the difference was more than a matter of duration. The ship handled the open ocean in ways her crew had not fully experienced before. Her great length, an asset in calm coastal waters where it allowed her to carry an enormous cargo efficiently, became something more complicated in the longer swells of the deep Atlantic, where a hull of her dimensions could be worked by wave patterns that a smaller vessel might ride more easily. Her limited maneuverability, tolerable when land and shelter remained near, took on a different character when there was no coastline to run for, no harbor to duck into should conditions turn difficult. None of this, the surviving accounts suggest, produced any crisis during the crossing itself. The ship made her way across the ocean in what appears to have been an uneventful passage, if a demanding one, her crew managing the unfamiliar conditions with the steady competence such voyages required, her captain maintaining the course that would bring them in time to the approaches of the English coast. It was as the Lawson neared the end of this long crossing that she came within sight of the Isles of Scilly, a scattered cluster of small islands and treacherous rocks lying off the southwestern tip of England, a place that had claimed ships for centuries before the Lawson's arrival and would claim more after her. The islands marked, in the ordinary course of a voyage such as this, not a destination but a waypoint, a final navigational landmark before a ship bound for London might turn northeast along the channel toward her ultimate port. For most vessels making this approach in reasonable weather, the Scilly Isles represented little more than a familiar hazard to be noted and avoided, a place where careful navigation and modest caution were sufficient to see a ship safely past toward calmer waters beyond. The Lawson approached these islands in conditions that had, until that point, given her captain and crew no particular cause for alarm, the long crossing nearly complete, the cargo intact, the ship herself having answered the demands of the open Atlantic with whatever combination of strain and endurance her unfamiliar construction allowed. It was here, within sight of land after so many days at sea, that the character of the voyage would begin to change, as the weather that had permitted her long crossing gave way to something considerably less forgiving, and the ship that had crossed an ocean without serious incident found herself, at the very edge of her destination, facing conditions that would test her as nothing in her 3 years of coastal service ever had. The weather that gathered over the western approaches to England in those first days of December did not announce itself as catastrophe. It arrived instead the way most Atlantic storms arrive at that latitude in that season, as a lowering of the sky and a slow thickening of the air, a change any sailor who had spent time in those waters would have recognized without needing to name it. The wind backed and freshened by degrees. The swell, already substantial from the long crossing, began to build in a way that suggested more weather behind it than was yet visible. None of this was remarkable in itself. The waters around the Scilly Isles, that scattered granite outpost lying some 25 miles off the southwestern tip of Cornwall, had claimed vessels for centuries before the Lawson ever approached them, and would claim vessels after, simply by virtue of being where the open Atlantic met a coastline of reefs and rocks and swift, unforgiving currents. What was gathering over the Lawson in those hours was, in the most literal sense, only weather. It became something else only in combination with where the ship happened to be standing when it arrived. She had anchored near Annette, a small and uninhabited island at the southwestern edge of the Scillies, to await a pilot who could guide her safely through the intricate approaches to the mainland. This was standard practice, unremarkable in itself, the kind of pause that thousands of vessels before her had made in those same waters, waiting in the lee of the islands for a local hand who knew the channels and the rocks well enough to bring a deep-draft vessel through safely. The Lawson's captain, a man named George Dow, had made the same request that any prudent master would have made, and the delay that followed was not, at the time, cause for particular concern. The islands offered some shelter. The anchors were sound. There was no reason, in the ordinary run of things, to expect that a wait for a pilot would become anything more than an inconvenience, a day or two of patience before the final short run to port. But the storm that had been gathering did not remain moderate. Through the evening of the 6th of December, the wind continued to build, and the anchorage that had seemed adequate shelter began to reveal itself as something considerably more exposed than it had first appeared. The Lawson, riding at anchor with her 7 masts bare of sail, presented an enormous surface to wind and sea. Even in that condition, her rigging alone a considerable catch for a gale that was now blowing with a violence that left little room for misunderstanding about what was coming. The crew, watching the weather deteriorate through the failing light, would have understood by then that they were not merely waiting out an inconvenience. They were riding out a storm, at anchor, in a location chosen for its convenience to a pilot, rather than for its shelter from exactly this kind of weather. The anchors began to fail sometime in the night. The accounts that survive, drawn from the handful of men who lived to give them, describe the failure as sequential rather than sudden, one chain parting or one anchor losing its hold, and then, as the strain shifted onto those remaining, another going the same way, the ship's grip on the seabed loosening link by link as the storm did the work that storms of that ferocity do to vessels caught exposed. Each failure would have been felt aboard as a lurch, a shift in the ship's motion as she swung further and dragged closer to the rocks that ringed the anchorage, the crew below decks and on deck alike aware, in the way sailors are always aware of such things, that the margin between holding and not holding was narrowing with each hour that passed. By some accounts, every anchor the ship carried gave way before the night was through. The enormous vessel finally left to the mercy of wind and current, with nothing beneath her holding her in place. What the crew did in those hours, they did with whatever tools remained to them. And the record, thin as it is, suggests men who worked at the business of trying to save their ship, rather than men who surrendered to the inevitability of what was coming. There would have been attempts to work canvas onto her, however briefly, in hopes of gaining some measure of control once free of the anchors, though a ship of her size and unfamiliar rig, caught in full gale with darkness closing in, offered little real prospect of being sailed clear of a rocky coast under those conditions. There would have been the desperate, unglamorous labor common to every ship in every such crisis, men moving where they could, doing what could be done with the equipment at hand, aware that the outcome had likely already been decided by forces well beyond anything seamanship alone could answer. The record does not preserve a detailed account of exactly what was attempted in those final hours, only the outcome. And it seems fitting to remember the effort itself with the respect due to men laboring against odds they understood better than anyone, rather than to imagine spectacle where none was recorded. The end, when it came with the particular finality that steel hulls meet rock. The Lawson, driven by wind and current onto the rocks near Annette, struck with a force that no construction, however innovative, however carefully engineered, could have been expected to survive. Her steel plates, strong against the ordinary strains of an ocean crossing, were no match for the specific violence of a hull grinding against granite in a gale, and she began to break apart with the particular speed that marks a large vessel meeting an immovable obstacle at the height of a storm. Oil from her cargo, it is said, spread across the water as her tanks ruptured, coating the waves and the wreckage alike, a detail preserved in the accounts less for its drama than for what it suggests about how quickly and thoroughly the ship came apart once the rocks had done their work. Of the crew aboard the Lawson, and of the men from the pilot boat who had come out to assist her, the losses were severe. Most of the ship's crew did not survive the night, drowned in the wreckage or lost to the sea in the chaos of the ship's breaking apart, their bodies claimed by waters that offered little chance of rescue even to strong swimmers in conditions of that severity. The pilot cutter's crew, who had come out in the worst of the weather in an effort to bring help or guidance to the stricken vessel, suffered losses of their own, men who had gone out to do the ordinary work of their calling and found themselves caught in the same storm that was destroying the ship they had come to assist. The total loss of life that night numbered in the dozens, a toll heavy enough that it would be remembered in the islands for generations, spoken of in the quiet way that maritime communities speak of nights when the sea took more than it gave back. The survivors who did live to tell of it were few, and their accounts, as recorded afterward, are notable for their restraint, the plain, factual language of men who had witnessed something they did not attempt to embellish. They spoke of the anchors parting, of the ship driving onto the rocks, of the scramble to survive in water thick with wreckage and spreading oil, of the particular cold and violence of a December sea in full storm. They spoke, where they spoke at all, without the ornamentation that might have been expected of such a tale, offering instead the kind of spare testimony that seems, in hindsight, entirely fitting for a disaster of this scale, the facts themselves carrying weight enough without need of elaboration. It is in these brief, factual accounts, more than in any subsequent retelling, that the human cost of that night is best preserved. A handful of men describing, without artifice, the hours in which the largest schooner ever built came to her end. By morning, what remained of the Thomas W. Lawson was scattered wreckage among the rocks off Annet, her 7 masts gone, her steel hull broken beyond any hope of salvage, her cargo lost to the sea along with most of the men who had sailed her across the Atlantic without serious incident only days before. The storm that had done this was, in its essentials, an ordinary storm for that place and that season, remarkable only in its intersection with a ship that had never been designed with such conditions foremost in mind, anchored in a location chosen for convenience rather than shelter, at the one moment when shelter mattered more than anything else her design or her crew could offer. What remained of her in the days that followed was not so much a wreck in the traditional sense as a slow dissolution. The 7 masts, which had made her silhouette so unmistakable on the water, were gone entirely, snapped and scattered and swallowed, leaving no trace above the surface to mark where a ship of her size had gone down. Divers and later observers who came to know the site would describe a hull broken into sections, steel plates torn and folded by the force of rock and wave, the great length of her no longer a single vessel, but a scattering of iron across a seabed that had claimed larger ships before her and would claim others after. There was no possibility of salvage. Whatever cargo of oil remained in her tanks bled slowly into the water around Annet, and for days afterward the local accounts spoke of a slick spreading along the coastline, coating rocks and gathering in the tide pools, a dark sheen on water that had, only a short time before, been clear enough to see the wreck settling beneath it. The people of the Scilly Isles, who had watched the storm from their windows and who had launched their boats into the worst of it to bring back what survivors they could, now watched the sea deliver its aftermath in a slower and less dramatic form, oil and wreckage washing ashore in the days that followed, a quiet and unglamorous coda to a night that had already taken most of what mattered. The oil itself became, in local memory, almost as significant as the wreck. It fouled the beaches for weeks, an unfamiliar intrusion on islands that depended on clean water and clear shores for their small fisheries and their modest livelihoods. Some accounts from the time describe it as one of the first instances of a coastal oil spill within living memory of the islanders, a foretaste of a kind of maritime disaster that would become increasingly familiar as the 20th century wore on and ships carried ever larger volumes of petroleum across the same waters. For a ship remembered chiefly for her size and her masts, it was a strange final signature to leave on the world, not splintered wood or torn canvas, but a slick of oil against grey Atlantic rock, evidence that she had belonged in the end less to the age of sail that had produced her rigging than to the industrial age that had filled her holds. In the weeks after the wreck, an inquiry was convened, as was customary when a vessel of her registry and her notoriety went down with such loss of life. The questions raised were not dramatic in themselves, but they were pointed. Investigators wanted to know why she had anchored where she had, whether the position chosen off the Scilly Isles had offered any real shelter from a storm of the kind that regularly passed through those waters, and whether her handling in the hours before the anchors failed had been what it should have been. There were questions, too, about her design itself, revived now in a harder light than the admiring newspaper coverage of her launch had allowed. Her critics, who had never entirely gone quiet in the years since her construction, found in her loss a vindication of doubts they had voiced from the beginning, that a vessel of her length, rigged with so many masts and dependent on such an unusual configuration of sail, might handle certain conditions well enough while remaining fundamentally vulnerable in others, particularly when maneuverability under difficult circumstances was required and her design offered little of it. The inquiry's findings, as such inquiries often are, were measured and cautious, attributing the loss to the severity of the storm and to the specific misfortune of her anchors failing at the worst possible moment, without either fully exonerating her design or fully condemning it. It was the kind of conclusion that satisfied no one entirely and left the underlying question of whether a ship built purely to maximize cargo and minimize crew could ever be truly safe in extremity, hanging unresolved in the record, much as it had hung unresolved throughout her 7 years of service. Word of the wreck reached Boston and reached Thomas W. Lawson himself in the ordinary way that such news traveled in those years, by telegraph and by newspaper column, arriving at a remove of both distance and time that made the disaster feel to him less like a personal loss than a report from a world he had already largely left behind. By the time his namesake went down off Annette, Lawson's fortunes had changed considerably from the days when he had backed her construction with the confidence of a man who believed his success would only continue to compound. Financial reversals had diminished both his wealth and his public standing in the years since her launch, and the newspapers that had once delighted in his ventures now covered him, when they covered him at all, with a more skeptical eye. Whatever he felt on hearing that the ship bearing his name had broken apart in a storm off the English coast, with the loss of most of her crew, was not extensively recorded for posterity. There is no dramatic quote attributed to him in the aftermath, no statement of grief or defiance that survives in the historical record with any reliability. What can be said is that the loss came at a low point in his own affairs, and that the ship which had once stood as a monument to his ambition now stood, in its ruin, as an unwelcome footnote to a life that was itself heading toward decline. He would not live to see his fortune fully recovered, nor would the ship that carried his name ever be raised, repaired, or replaced. Both, in their different ways, were finished by the events of that December. No one built another seven-masted schooner. This fact, simple as it sounds, carries more weight the longer one considers it. She had been conceived as the logical extension of a trend, the culmination of a decade in which schooners had grown from 3 masts to 4, from 4 to 5, from 5 to 6, each addition justified by the same commercial logic that had produced the Lawson herself: more sail, more cargo, fewer men required per ton carried. Her builders and her owners had every reason to believe, at the time of her launch, that she represented not an endpoint, but a waypoint, that 6-masted and 7-masted schooners might soon become an unremarkable feature of the American coastal trade, with larger vessels following in time as engineering and confidence permitted. That future never arrived. Her loss, following as it did a difficult service record marked by handling troubles and questions about her seaworthiness even before the final storm, seems to have settled the matter for shipbuilders and owners alike without the need for extensive public debate. The 7-masted schooner, rather than becoming a new class of vessel, remained a singular experiment, undertaken once, tested for 7 years, and then abandoned by the simple fact that no one came forward to repeat it. This quiet foreclosure of a design took place, moreover, within a maritime world that was itself changing in ways that made the entire question increasingly academic. The years of her service were also the years in which steam power and, increasingly, the internal combustion engine were displacing sail across nearly every category of commercial shipping. The economics that had once favored building ever larger sailing vessels with their promise of cheap cargo capacity and minimal fuel costs were being steadily undercut by engines that offered speed, schedule reliability, and independence from wind and weather that no configuration of masts and canvas could match. The great schooners of the coastal trade, the Lawson among them, represented in this sense less the future of sail than its last elaborate flourishing. A final attempt to wring additional efficiency from a technology that was already, quietly and irreversibly, being superseded. Her 7 masts, so remarkable when raised on the Fore River, were in retrospect less a beginning than an ending, the largest and most ambitious expression of a kind of ship that had already, without quite announcing it, entered its twilight. What lingers in the end is the speed with which a vessel built to set records became instead a name invoked mainly as a warning. She had drawn crowds to the shipyard, filled newspaper columns with wonder at her scale, and carried genuine cargo across real oceans for 7 years without catastrophe, and yet the manner of her ending was such that it overshadowed all of that, reducing her in popular memory to a cautionary tale about ambition outrunning prudence. It is a common enough pattern in the history of great ships, this rapid inversion of reputation, but rarely has it happened so completely or so soon as it did with the only seven-masted schooner ever built. In the decades that followed, the Thomas W. Lawson settled into the kind of afterlife reserved for ships whose fame outlasted their usefulness. She appeared in maritime histories not as a case study in commercial innovation, but as an anecdote, a paragraph wedged between accounts of clipper ships and steam turbines, offered as proof that the age of sail had reached a point of diminishing returns. Historians writing broad surveys of American shipbuilding would mention her by name, note the seven masts, note the wreck, and move on, as though the shape of her story required no further elaboration. She had become shorthand. To say a project was another Thomas W. Lawson was to invoke overreach, to suggest that scale for its own sake invited ruin. This was not entirely fair to the vessel or to the men who built her, but it was the verdict that stuck, repeated in enough books and enough classrooms, that it hardened into something like consensus, even among those who had never examined the details of her 7 years of ordinary, competent service before the storm off Annet. It took the patient work of later researchers to soften that verdict, or at least to complicate it. In the 20th century, as diving technology improved and interest in shipwreck archaeology grew beyond the recovery of treasure into the recovery of history, attention returned to the waters off the Scilly Isles. Divers who visited the site where the Lawson had gone down found what remained largely as earlier accounts had suggested: a hull broken and scattered across a rocky bottom, iron and steel fittings encrusted with decades of marine growth, the great masts long since reduced to whatever pieces had not been salvaged or dispersed by current and storm in the years immediately following the wreck. There was no dramatic recovery, no single artifact that reintroduced the ship to public consciousness the way a bell or a nameplate sometimes does for other wrecks. What the divers found instead was confirmation, a physical anchor for a story that had until then existed mostly in newspaper clippings and second-hand memory. The wreck was real, its position roughly matched the accounts, and its condition told a quiet story of violence absorbed slowly by rock and tide, rather than in a single catastrophic instant. Documentation efforts continued in a modest, unhurried way over the following decades. Local historians in the Scilly Isles, along with maritime archaeologists working from the mainland, compiled what records existed, cross-referencing survivor testimony, newspaper accounts, and the physical evidence of the site itself, attempting to build as complete a picture as the surviving material allowed. There was no large-scale excavation, no attempt to raise significant portions of the hull. The Lawson's resting place was treated with the same measured respect given to other historic wrecks in waters that held many such sites, protected informally by distance, depth, and the simple fact that there was little of commercial value left to recover. What mattered to those who studied her was not treasure, but understanding, the slow accumulation of detail that allowed the wreck to be properly situated in the record of that terrible December night, and in the larger record of a design that had never been repeated. On the islands themselves, memory persisted in a way that owed more to community than to scholarship. The people of Annet and the surrounding Scillies had watched the wreck unfold from their own shores, had recovered survivors and buried the dead, and the story remained part of local history in the way that maritime disasters often do in small coastal communities, passed down through families whose grandparents or great-grandparents had been present that night. A plaque was eventually placed to mark the event, modest in scale, noting the date and the ship's name for visitors who might otherwise walk past the site without knowing what had happened there. Local historical societies kept accounts of the wreck in their records, and guides leading visitors around the islands would sometimes point toward Annet and mention, almost in passing, that the largest schooner ever built had come to grief on those rocks. A detail that surprised most listeners who had no reason to know that a vessel with 7 masts had ever existed at all. This was memory at its most durable and least dramatic, sustained not by museums or major publications, but by the simple habit of communities to remember what happened on their own shores. Among historians of ship design, the Lawson prompted a narrower but more persistent debate, one that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with the choice that had produced her in the first place. Why had no one built another seven-masted schooner? The absence itself was the puzzle. If the design had worked, if it had genuinely represented a viable extension of schooner rigging into larger vessels, one would expect other owners, other yards, to have followed, at least experimentally. That no one did suggested to some scholars that the design carried inherent limitations that the Lawson's own service, however uneventful for most of her career, had not fully exposed until conditions turned severe. Her difficulty maneuvering, the strain on her rigging in anything but favorable weather, the sheer unwieldiness of coordinating 7 masts and their attendant sails, all of this pointed toward a vessel that functioned adequately in calm or moderate conditions, but reached the edge of what her design could manage when genuinely tested. Other historians took a more sympathetic view, arguing that the design itself was sound enough, that her failure owed as much to circumstance, to an anchor that failed, and a coast that offered no mercy, as to any fundamental flaw in the 7-masted arrangement. Under this reading, the Lawson was simply unlucky, caught at the wrong moment in the wrong place, and her design might have proven itself capable under different circumstances had she been given the chance. The debate has never fully resolved, in part because there is no second data point. A single ship, however long her service, cannot settle a question that would require a fleet or at least a handful of comparable vessels to answer with any confidence. And so the 7-masted schooner remains a singular experiment, its lessons permanently entangled with the specifics of one storm on one December night. Lawson himself left behind a rare and valuable window into his own thinking about the vessel that bore his name, in writings composed before her loss, when she still represented to him the triumph he had intended her to be. He wrote of her not merely as an investment, but as a demonstration, a proof that American ambition and American steel could produce something the shipping world had not yet imagined. A vessel whose scale alone would announce that the country building her had reached a new confidence in its own industrial capacity. He described the calculations behind her rigging with the enthusiasm of a man convinced he had solved a genuine engineering problem, framing the 7 masts not as excess, but as the logical solution to distributing the strain of sail across a hull of unprecedented length. Reading these accounts now, after the fact of her loss, lends them an unavoidable irony. But they remain valuable precisely because they capture the optimism of the moment before consequences arrived, offering historians a first-person record of the reasoning that produced her, uncomplicated by the hindsight that later shaped nearly everything written about the ship. Today, the wreck rests where it settled more than a century ago, off the low, dark shape of Anne, visited occasionally by divers and researchers, but otherwise left to the slow patience of the sea. There is no monument beneath the water, no careful reconstruction of what once stood 18 decks above the waves. What remains is scattered, corroded, half-buried in sand that shifts with each season's storms, indistinguishable at a glance from any of the countless other wrecks that line that stretch of coast. And yet it holds a particular significance among them, as one of the last physical traces of an experiment in scale that was never repeated, the closing chapter of an idea that began in an owner's confidence and ended on a shoal in a winter gale. The ship that had once been the largest sailing vessel in the world now exists mainly as scattered iron on a seabed and a handful of paragraphs in maritime histories. But for those willing to look closely, she remains exactly what she always was, proof of how far ambition could be pushed and how the sea, eventually, always found the limit. What remains, in the end, is the shape of a story that ran its course quickly and completely, the way certain lives do, burning bright and brief rather than long and steady. The Thomas W. Lawson was conceived in ambition, built in confidence, launched to astonishment, and lost within 4 years to a storm that cared nothing for her tonnage or her 7 masts or the pride that had gone into raising them. It is a short arc when set against the centuries of maritime history that surround it, but it is a complete one, and there is a kind of clarity in that completeness. She was built to prove that a schooner could be made larger than any before her, and she proved it. She was lost, proving that no design, however clever, could fully answer to the sea's own terms. Both truths belong to her equally, and neither cancels the other. She was, in the fullest sense, exactly what she was built to be, and she was also, in the end, exactly as vulnerable as any wooden or steel hull ever has been when the wind and the rocks agree to test it. There is a pattern here that reaches back far beyond Fore River and forward past it as well, though the Lawson herself marked something of an ending. Shipbuilders across centuries have returned again and again to the same temptation: to make the next vessel larger than the last, to answer the limits of one design by pushing past them with another. It is not a foolish impulse. Larger ships have often meant more efficient ones, cargo carried at lower cost per ton, fewer crews required per unit of freight moved, economies of scale made real in timber and canvas and, later, in steel and steam. The instinct that led William Coughlin and his backers to imagine a seven-masted schooner was the same instinct that had built four-masted barks and five-masted ships before her. The same instinct that would soon build steamships larger than any sailing vessel could ever hope to be. Bigger was, for a long stretch of maritime history, simply better, or was believed to be, and belief of that kind has a way of becoming its own justification. But the sea has never been especially interested in belief. It has a way of absorbing every increase in scale and answering it, sooner or later, with a proportional increase in consequence. A ship built larger carries more cargo, but she also presents more surface to a gale, more strain to her own rigging, more distance between the men working her bow and the men working her stern, more time required to bring her about, more weight to be thrown against a shoal if the wind refuses to cooperate. The Lawson's masts, so impressive when counted from a dock in Boston, became 7 separate points of vulnerability once she was caught on a night when every one of them mattered and none of them could save her. Scale is not a pure advantage, it is a trade, and the sea collects on every trade eventually. The Lawson's story is, in this sense, not an aberration but an illustration, one particularly vivid example of a pattern that shipbuilders have tested against the water again and again, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, for as long as there have been ships to build. It is worth sitting for a moment with the image of those 7 masts themselves, because they carry a double meaning that neither cancels the other. They were, without question, an achievement. No one before Coughlin's yard had raised 7 masts on a single working schooner, had rigged them, had sailed a vessel of that configuration across open water, carrying real cargo for real profit, however briefly that profit lasted. The masts were proof of engineering confidence, of a shipwright's willingness to solve a problem that had never been solved before, of steel construction methods mature enough to support ambitions that wooden hulls could never have carried. And yet the same 7 masts, spread wide with schooner-rigged sail, gave her the very handling problems that plagued her from her first trials onward, the sluggish response, the difficulty coming about, the sense among her masters that she was more easily started than stopped, more easily driven forward than turned safely aside. Achievement and overreach were not separate qualities layered onto the same hull. They were the same fact, viewed from 2 directions. The masts that made her remarkable were the same masts that made her difficult, and in the end, on the rocks off Annette, they were the masts that could not be reduced quickly enough to save her. None of this diminishes what should be said plainly and without qualification about the people who were aboard her that night. 16 men died when the Thomas W. Lawson broke apart on the rocks in that December gale. And their names, where they survive in the record, deserve to be spoken with the same care given to the ship herself. A tugboat captain who came out in worsening weather to try to help her. A local pilot who boarded her in good faith, believing his knowledge of the coast might see her through, and who did not survive the night despite that knowledge. Members of her crew who had signed on for a coal run across the Atlantic and found themselves instead fighting canvas and chain in the dark, with the rocks of the Isles of Scilly closing in on a lee shore that offered no mercy. 2 men survived. The rest did not. Whatever else is remembered about the Lawson's engineering, her scale, her brief celebrity as the largest sailing vessel in the world, that loss of life belongs at the center of her story, not the margins. Ships can be rebuilt in memory through drawings and photographs and the patient work of divers cataloging wreckage. Lives cannot be recovered by any of that. The reverence owed to the men who died that night is not lessened by the passage of more than a century, and it should not be crowded out by admiration for masts and tonnage, however impressive those figures remain. The coast where it happened has not much changed. Annet still lies low and grey against the surrounding water, its rocks still catching the tide the same way they caught it in 1907, indifferent to the fact that a ship once broke apart against them. On a calm day, the water around the Scilly Isles can look almost gentle, pale green over white sand in the shallows. The kind of scene that gives no hint of what a winter gale can do to that same stretch of sea when the wind turns and the tide runs wrong. Divers who have visited the wreck site describe scattered iron, sections of hull plating settled into the seabed, anchors and chain half buried in sand, the quiet disassembly of a ship into her constituent parts, no longer a vessel but a scatter of evidence for those willing to look. The rocks that ended her are still there, still marked on charts, still known locally by the names sailors gave them long before Coughlin ever imagined a seven-masted hull. The sea kept its shape. The ship did not. There is a kind of honesty in that persistence. The Lawson was, for a handful of years, the largest sailing vessel afloat, a genuine marvel of her moment, discussed in newspapers, photographed at her berth, remembered by those who saw her pass. And then she was gone, reduced within a single night to wreckage and a short list of names lost, her achievement and her failure bound together so tightly that neither can be told without the other. Wood, steel, and wind all have their limits, and shipbuilders across every era have tested those limits in turn, sometimes finding a margin of safety, sometimes finding none. The Lawson found none, and the finding cost 16 lives and one remarkable hull, broken finally against rocks that had been waiting, patient and unmoved, long before she was ever built and long after she was gone. That is where her story rests, and where this account of her leaves off. For those who find themselves drawn to accounts like this one, to the slow unfolding of ambition and craft and the sea's quiet answer to both, there are other ships and other builders waiting to be told about in turn, gathered gently on this channel for whenever the listener cares to return to them.